Hey everyone, it is Gabe from Babylon Journey, and I'm excited to dive into this video. We are going to talk about 360 photos and 360 videos in Babylon using the PhotoDome class. And I know I haven't posted for a couple weeks, been very busy preparing the next release of Frame, which is the Babylon-based metaverse product that I build with the Frame team. Very excited about this release and really pumped to show it to you all. But that's just why I've been a little bit busier lately. All right, so this is the demo that we're going to make, and it's a pretty simple kind of like 360 photo viewer. I'm going to make a way to do a nice smooth fade out, fade in transition between different 360 photos. I'm going to show you how to make a zoom out and zoom in button, and I'll show you how to just do a simple pause play on the 360 photo kind of viewing experience. Okay, so let's get into it. As always, I'm going to have this code sandbox ready for you to just fork and dive into. Just like the method of my last video, rather than me just code it out live, I've got it all coded, and I'm just going to walk through how it's set up and point out any kind of interesting things along the way. So I've got my scene like boilerplate up at the top. This is the kind of stuff you see in all the videos. I import what I need from the Babylon library so that you don't need to import the whole thing. It's better for tree shaking and bundle size. I import what I need from the Babylon GUI library because, as you can see, we're using some Babylon GUI buttons here on the side. And then I have also imported a couple images. These are the actual 360 photos that you are going to cycle between in the experience. Now I've set up the canvas, doing a get element by ID for a render canvas that I have created in the index.html, ID render canvas, just hooking into that canvas, no problem. And creating the engine, the Babylon engine, passing in that canvas, making the scene, making a little hemispheric light, although I don't think the light was really needed in here, but this light is in here. And then I'm making a universal camera. Now I'm doing a universal camera instead of an arc rotate camera just because I really just need a basic camera. The arc rotate camera is really good for like rotating around a pivot point. I didn't really need that here. Just a universal camera is fine. And then, of course, I've attached the camera to the canvas so that it's responsive. When you click and drag on the canvas, it rotates the camera. Set up the render loop, render the scene, add a little resize listener, and we are good to go. This is the typical kind of like just boilerplate for any Babylon scene. And then we get into the good stuff. So first what I've done, because when you first go to it, right, I'm actually showing, I'm going to refresh the page here, I'm actually showing a 360 photo. And I've done this with the PhotoDome class, which is a Babylon class. And as always, I encourage you to actually just check the documentation for the class itself, because I'm only going to be able to go over a couple of these properties, but it's got a ton more, and I'll put the link to this in the video description. Babylon also has a PhotoDome class that is kind of like a really easy wrapper to help you get videos in there as well. We use both of these classes, by the way, in the product that I make, Frame. This 360 photo out here, this is using PhotoDome, and if you bring in a 360 video and pop it up, then that uses the PhotoDome class, and we let you just like cycle between a sky and this. This actually creates a PhotoDome and maps a texture to it, which is what we're learning how to do right here, which is fun. So the PhotoDome constructor, it takes a few arguments, and you can see, just hover over it to see them all. But you give it a name. I've just given it sphere. You can pass in an image source, which is nice, or you can pass in a texture if you've like already made a texture with the Babylon texture class. I've just passed in the like kind of the reference to the image itself that I've already imported above. So just pass it right in. And then you can set its resolution, which will certainly determine kind of like how crispy it looks. It'll still only work. I mean, you need a good source file, right? Like the resolution of your image has to be good. But this will let you kind of like gate its resolution sort of, or you can pump it up. You can set its size, and imagine the PhotoDome is sort of like this really large sphere that is in your scene. But it's got to be really big because you're mapping a texture to it, and then it's all around your entire scene. So if your scene is like really, really, really big, like let's say the floor is like, width like a size 1,000, you might need the PhotoDome to be like even bigger so that it wraps around it. It like really encircles and encapsulates your scene. For this, just like 1,000 was fine. I mean, I don't even have anything else in my scene, so this could actually be probably potentially smaller. And then I've turned use direct mapping to false. I have found that sometimes when this was true, my sphere would be flipped vertically. And so I turned this off, and then I read about this a little bit, and it turns out that just turning this off will adds another like little check to it when it first loads, but it'll sort of make sure that it's oriented the right way when you're like changing spheres or making a new sphere. So I have that set. Okay, now so that actually creates the general like sphere itself just in the back here, right? If you just did this, it wouldn't be this nice smooth rotation I have, but you'd at least see the photo and you'd be able to look all around using your camera. So that alone is pretty cool. Just with one little class, it makes a nice 360 photo for you. Now there are lots of ways to make this kind of like 360 photo background. We've actually seen a few in earlier videos. You can do like skybox texture on the environment and some others. But this one gives you a lot of flexibility if you're primarily making an experience that really revolves around 360 photos and doing different things with them, like things like zoom out and zoom in. These aren't things you can do with the skybox texture on like the scene environment creation helpers. Okay, so let's get into the buttons. And the buttons are pretty straightforward. We've actually seen similar things in previous videos, but I'm making a full screen UI with this, which is a method on the advanced dynamic texture class. This is like the Babylon way of sort of making this like big overlay UI that lets you put buttons and GUI elements kind of anywhere you want, but they're overlaid on top of the experience, not really embedded inside of like world space per se. They're like overlaid on top of world space, which is why these buttons just always stay here. If these were in world space, then we'd actually be seeing them like move around as I was rotating the camera, but they're overlaid on top. Okay, and then I've made the container that kind of like stacks them all up like this is a stack panel. A stack panel is just like a Babylon GUI container that you can add things to, and it'll automatically just like stack them up either horizontally or vertically. And it's vertical by default, which is what I want. I wanted this like vertical line of buttons. Okay, now I wanted this stack panel, the way that I got it like flush to the right and centered was by setting their horizontal alignment. The stack panel, I did horizontal alignment right, which shoves it to the right, and I did vertical alignment center. And you can access these right and center on the control class, which I just clicked on accidentally, but that's fine. But yeah, that's why I've imported this control class, because it gives you these values here that you can plug into the horizontal and vertical alignment. Once I've set them, then I've just added them to that overall like full screen UI container, which we made up here, which I talked about before. So this is advanced texture.add control stack panel, and that'll add it to the right and to the center. Lovely. But we need things in our stack panel. We need buttons and things like that. So what I've done was I've imported that button class from the GUI library. And then I've done this like little helper function I have just for create simple button. This is good for buttons that are literally just like text. That's all I wanted. A bunch of text buttons. Didn't need to get any fancier than this really. For button 1, That's the button, like in create simple button, it just takes 2 arguments. You kind of name the button and then you define the text that actually shows up on the button. Button 1, as you can see, is Alps, and it is green. And here's where that button is defined. I give it a width, 100. I've used pixels for this. I've given it a height. I've given it a text color. This is the text color. And I've given it a thickness of 2 because it's the one that is selected first, the Alps. This is a 360 photo of northern Italy where you can see Alps in the background. Looks amazing. I didn't take this photo, by the way, but I did take the other one. We're going to get to that one soon. Okay, now to make something happen when I click on the button, that's when you want to use one of these observables. And any Babylon GUI like control that is clickable, it'll have various pointer observables. And the one I wanted was on pointer up. I didn't want on pointer down. I wanted this to happen once you on pointer up. That's like a full click, right? And when that happens, what I want to happen as a result gets put inside of this observable. And I want to make the thickness of the button 2. That's why like the one you click on gets thick, that thick white border around it. And then the other one, the other button, which I defined below, I make its thickness 0. That's just so the user can see which one is selected just using this thickness. And then once I've made my button, just add it to the stack panel, and that puts it in the stack that shows up. Then I make another button. This is the button that controls the other 360 photo, Gardens, and it's called Gardens. And I just made it look a little bit different. I've given it a red background. And this one on its pointer up observable, now I make the button 1 thickness 0 while making sure that the button 2 thickness, the button that's clicked gets a thickness of 2. Just highlighting for the user, okay, this one's selected. And then you'll see I'm also running these functions like transition, and then I pass in the reference to the image that I want to transition to. So we're going to have to get into, okay, what is this transition function that I've written? But first, you got to add that button 2 to your stack panel. And again, that just like places them nicely vertically. So far in the code, we've made Alps, we've made Gardens, we've seen how the thickness of those buttons, see how it gets that nice white border, that's the thickness property, and it helps you see which one is selected. We're seeing the transitions are also working, so let's dive into what's happening in this transition. Okay, so here's my transition function, and it is pretty straightforward. What I've done is I've made animations below. I've made a fade out animation and I've made a fade in animation. And on this transition function, which accepts a new image reference as its argument, but on this function, what I've done is I'm just triggering the fade out animation. And this is with the scene begin direct animation function, which lets you define what is going to get animated, the target, which in this case is the dome.mesh. You think about the PhotoDome. Remember, I made the PhotoDome class up above and assigned it to this dome variable. When you make a PhotoDome, you can access the mesh itself, like that sphere mesh itself that I described that is like surrounding your whole scene. You can access that with dome.mesh. And that's the target for my animation because I want to fade out that mesh. That's what gives us that nice like dissolving fade out transparency. So I'm grabbing that as the target of what I want to animate. And then I'm passing in an array of animations that I want to trigger. This is just how begin direct animation works. And I'm passing in the fade out animation. And then you also pass in from and to, defines the initial value, defines the final value. You define whether you want it to loop. In this case, we don't because it's just a one-time animation. And that's pretty much that. Now let's look at our fade out animation. I've defined this down below. Okay, so here's our fade out animation using a new instance of the animation class. This is how you just kind of like make an animation. It's not how you call the animation. We did that up above. This is how you kind of like define what the animation is and how fast it is and what values you're kind of working with. So I've said new animation. I've given it a name, just fade out, although this is really the reference to it that we use above, fade out animation. And you pass in a target property. This is the property that I want to animate. And the property I want to animate is the material.alpha. So you saw up above that I passed in dome.mesh as the kind of like thing that's going to get animated. Well, you have to dig in even further. Like, what exactly about dome.mesh is going to get animated? And in this case, it's the material, and specifically, it's the alpha value of the material, because the alpha controls that transparency. 1 is fully opaque, and if there's 0, then it's you can't see it at all. It's like fully transparent. Okay, now the animation type is float. We're just like manipulating floats, and constant just means, again, it's kind of like just a one-time thing. And then you set the keys for the animation. And the keys are kind of like if you've ever worked with keyframes, they're kind of like spots where you define where you expect the values of the property you're modifying to be at different phases of the animation. Now, I just have really 2 of these, 2 different keys. One is at frame 0, just like at the very beginning, what is the value going to be of the material.alpha? Well, it's going to be 1, because this is fade out, right? It starts at 1. But then by the end of it, at frame 120, I want the value to be 0. So from frame 0 to frame 120, this animation is going to animate between 1 and 0 for the material.alpha. Okay. And up here, remember, I've defined the frames per second as 40. So if it's doing 40 frames per second, and I have this set to, okay, at frame 0, have this be the value, but then at frame 120, have this be the value. Well, I'd expect this animation then to take roughly 3 seconds, right? It's going 40 frames per second, and I'm defining the end of it really being at frame 120. So that's 3 seconds, right? 120 divided by 40. Now, if I wanted to speed up this animation or not, then this is what I would be primarily adjusting. All right, now you can see the fade in animation is pretty much the exact same as the fade out. It's just that it has a different name, and its keys are different, so that the value is at first 0, and then by the end of the animation, the value is 1. Okay, so these are the animations that I call kind of like up above right here. In this transition function, I say, okay, begin direct animation, pass in the target, and then you pass in what animation I want to call. In this case, I want to say, let's get this fade out going. Let's make it happen. Okay, lovely. Now, the good thing about calling the animation this way is that you have a lot of control over it. There's like a helper animation function that's like create and run animation that gives you this like really easy way to do this, where you don't even need to necessarily set all this stuff up, which might seem like a lot of boilerplate. But when you do it this way, you have a few other tools in your kind of bag of tricks you can use. And specifically, it gives you a hook in to the on animation end. It lets you kind of set a callback for on animation end. Because you think about this transition, right? There's kind of a few things that have to happen in the proper sequence when I do this. I need to fade it out. And then when that's done, load in this new texture. And when that's done, start the fade in animation and so forth. So you actually want to have pretty fine-grained control over the cycle of callbacks. So this is why I've done the animation this way, because then I can hook in to the on animation end handler. And when on animation ends, this is what I want to have happen. I want to load the new texture, because we're about to, we're getting ready to load in this new 360 photo. But here already you can see how this fade out happens, okay? It's because I'm calling that fade out animation and you saw how it worked. It's targeting the material.alpha, and it's taking its value from 1 to 0 at the rate that we've described with these frames and frames per second of the animation. Okay, lovely. So we've done fade out, and I've chained it so that when that fade out animation is done, I call another function, and this function is called load new texture. And then I pass in the image that's been passed into the transition function. Remember, when you click this button up here, we call the transition function. We pass in a reference to that image that we want to move to, the 360 photo that we want to load in. Transition function itself takes that image, but primarily just passes it to this other function down below that runs once the animation is done, once we fade it out. So then we load the new texture. And load new texture is pretty straightforward. I kind of just wanted to, I wanted to make sure the texture was like loaded in really before doing other things. So what I did was I made a new Babylon texture, and then the texture class itself also has an onLoad observable. And when that texture is loaded, I dispose of the dome. That kind of like just gets rid of the dome as it existed before. And then I recreate a new one. I make a new PhotoDome. And this time I'm passing in the image that has been passed into the function. I guess in theory I could also pass in this new texture itself. Let me actually change that, see if it still works. Because I've already made this, like, taken the time to make this new texture. So I'm going to pass in new texture that I've defined up here. And because I want to then fade it in, I want to start its alpha on the material at 0. So then I go in immediately after creating the PhotoDome and I say dome.mesh. It gets you access to the sphere itself that the texture is mapped onto. Grab its material, grab its alpha, set it to 0. Then I trigger the fade in animation, which as we saw was set up just like fade out, but it's reversed so that it starts the material.alpha at 0, but its final value is 1, and the same speed. So that's the whole like chain of what I have happening to achieve this fade out and fade in. And let me make sure that it still works given my recent little change. So I'm going to click on Gardens, fades out, loads in that new texture, makes that new PhotoDome, fades in. And the code here, and hopefully the explanation that I did before, kind of helps you make sense of how all those things are happening. The key is really kind of using these callbacks and these observables to make sure that you're running code at the right time and avoiding like race conditions and things like that. So overview, high-level recap, click on the button in the GUI, call that transition function, pass in the image you want to move to. In the transition function, I call first my fade out animation. When that animation is done, I call load new texture. I load in the new texture. I make a new Babylon texture with that image that I want to move to. When that texture's been loaded on the onLoad observable, I dispose of the previous dome. I load in a new dome with that texture, that new texture, set its material alpha to 0, and then I trigger my fade in animation. Then it fades in. Amazing. Okay, that's exciting. Now let's get into the zoom in and zoom out, because this is another pretty cool little part of this. So zoom in and zoom out, I just made, for the buttons, easy enough. Same method as before, create simple button. But this time on the on pointer up observable, what I'm doing is manipulating the field of view of the camera. So the camera has a field of view property, and basically what I've done is just adjusted that. If your camera has a wider field of view, then it'll give you this kind of zoom out effect. And if it's got a smaller field of view, then it'll appear as if it's zooming in. Now notice that it's not really, I mean, it has this like illusion of zooming in and zooming out, and that works just fine. But notice that that will come at the expense of resolution, right? If you zoom in a whole lot, like, yeah, you're zooming in, but I would need like more 360 photos of farther away if you still wanted that to look really crisp. By the way, I did capture this 360 photo. That is me and my wife at the Borghese Gardens in Rome. She is paddling while I am awkwardly taking 360 photos, getting blinded by the sun, but it is what it is. This was just a couple months ago. Notice that I'm using an Insta360 camera with the stick, and they have this like AI magic that like takes the stick out of the picture. That's where the stick would be, like coming out of my hand. But anyway, as you can see, that's how I achieved the zoom effect, just by doing the camera, adjusting the field of view of the camera to kind of narrow in or widen out the perspective, which is pretty cool. And now finally, last but not least, I have the photo, the 360 photo just having this nice like little rotation effect, which I sort of like, but I made a button that lets you pause and play it. It's playing by default, but just the way that I did this, I made, first I defined a variable, is rotation plane. This could probably be a let instead of the old school var, but whatever. So is rotation plane, I've set to true. I've set a rotation speed, which is very slow, because when this looks too fast, it can be a little dizzying. I've made a button in the GUI for controlling the rotation, which is right down here. And I've made its background purple. So for this one, on the pointer up observable, right, when it's clicked, I toggle the is rotation plane variable, just flipping it from whatever it is. I change the text on the button itself. Now, when you do button.create simple button, it makes this like button container for you. And I've set the reference to that as rotation button. To actually dig into the text to change it, it's rotation button.textblock.text. And that'll let you actually manipulate the text itself on this simple button that you've created. That's how it changes from pause to play based on whether I've clicked it. And I've just said, look, set the text to be this, is rotation playing? If it's already playing, we'll make it pause. If it's not, then make the button say play. And then very simply, this is the other way. This is another way of achieving an animation, right? Which is just by hooking into the scene on before render observable, which like fires every frame. And I just say, look, if is rotation plane is true, then rotate the camera, increment the camera rotation a little bit, and specifically by the rotation speed. That's why when I adjust this rotation speed to make it a lot faster, you can see the impact because it's incrementing by that larger amount every frame. And that looks atrocious, right? That's just way, way too fast. That's what I did at first. We're going to make it nice and slow and gentle. Okay, so there you have it. That's how I've made a very simple demo with the PhotoDome class. I want to say that I encourage you to experiment with VideoDome. And also, if you're working with stereoscopic images that have like a top-down or left-right format for like those really fancy stereo 360 photos that have a nice sense of depth, like in VR, the PhotoDome class also supports that as well. You can initiate it with in side-by-side mode or top-bottom mode. And if you've got a 360 photo set up that way, and you set your PhotoDome with this, then when you're in VR, it actually maps a different image to each eye to achieve that really nice like depth sort of effect. So it's a very versatile class, and often it's just what you need. So go ahead and fork my demo, have fun with it. There are many different ways to achieve this transition. Looks like I broke something, probably with some typo in my last bunch of edits. That is no problem. But yeah, there you have it. Play around with the demo. Play around with 360 photos in Frame if you want. If you want a way to look at these 360 photos with other people, you can just bring them right in and share the link and so forth. But okay, enjoy.